Hello guys, welcome to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the optimal rune setups and the optimal itemization for Riven for the new ranked season, since it's starting over in the next few days. And I want to make sure that you guys, have the optimal stuff to go with, and you guys don't end up, I don't know, copying some wrong information from random like YouTube videos or even just like wrong people on Reddit talking about, I don't know, maybe they're trying Airy or Comet or some some random stuff that might not actually end up working for you. So yeah, let's get started. All right, guys, so the very first tree that we're going to be talking about is going to be the precision tree. And honestly, we're probably going to end up focusing mostly on the precision tree anyway, because it has the most optimal rune for Riven in terms of like, to be able to apply her damage and just in general being the one that would work out best for 99% of situations. So the very first rune that we're going to be talking about in the tree is going to be Conquer. Okay, Conquer is the strongest rune between Fleet, Lethal, or Press the Attack for Riven specifically, just because of the way that it works for her, right? The way that she stacks up the abilities fairly quickly and it gives her extra AD, which also, increases you passive damage, etc., right? So you're gonna be wanting to stick with that one for now, right? There's unless they end up like, I don't know, buffing lethal tempo an insane amount or something to the point where, all the other runes don't work anymore. But for now, Conquer is the way to go. And the second part of the tree, there's gonna be Overheal, right? Triumph and Presence of Mind. Well, Riven doesn't use mana, so we get rid of the Presence of Mind. We don't need that. Overheal we don't need either because, well, we'd rather have Triumph, honestly, for most of the time when you end up getting a kill and you get your health back and you have all those outplay moment situations, right? Especially with Riven, because she wants to survive with her E, etc. On the third tree, or like the third part of the tree, is actually one where you can actually kind of alternate between what's happening in your matchups and what the enemy team composition looks like, right? So Alacrity gives you attack speed, right? And it can be pretty useful if you want to have your combo being a little faster as you scale up with levels and the enemy team doesn't really have a lot of CC, right? So you don't need to actually, put any points into tenacity, or maybe you want Bloodline because it might give you a little bit of extra life steal as you scale up with levels, etc., right? So you kind of have to alternate between the three based on like what type of composition you're going against and what type of champions you're going against. So for example, if you end up playing against a team with Veigar mid lane, right, and then top lane has, I don't know, Rise or something, and then this is like a horrible composition already, but it doesn't really matter. You get my point. They go bot lane Leona, stacked up, filled with CC. That's when you would end up taking Tenacity, right? On the fourth side of the tree, you would end up going. You have the options of Cut Down, Coop, and Last Stand, right? These ones you end up picking again. It's kind of you're alternating based on what is happening on the enemy team. You know what they're picking, what type of champions do they have, how do your trades actually end up looking like. So if you end up, for example, going into a matchup where you think you're gonna end up getting low, right? And as you're trading with your opponent, last stand could be very beneficial. If you're going into a matchup that you think you're just gonna fight and it's gonna be really easy early or mid game, and you're not really gonna be in a situation where you're gonna get low, then you would go for Coop, right? And the same thing with Cut Down is if you're going against like a heavy tank that you can't kill, like an Ornn would be a good example, right? So that's pretty much it for the precision tree. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the secondary part of the tree. So for the first part of the tree, we ended up talking about how precision is 99% of the time, right? The most optimal way to go with her, because the other runes don't really end up working out for her. Thankfully, for the secondary part of the tree, you actually get two choices. You get to alternate between Resolve, and you get to alternate between Sorcery, right? So those two are going to be the key secondary trees that you're going to end up going for with Riven, okay? So I'm not going to talk about every single one of the runes in these trees because I'm going to talk about the most important ones, okay? So the primary one for the Resolve tree, the most important one, right, is Bone Plating, right? Usually when you end up going Resolve, you end up going for Bone Plating or Second Wind. That's like the key thing that will guarantee, or at least not guarantee, but change the matchups in a way that's advantageous to you, right? So if you're going into a matchup that is an early trading matchup and you want to make sure to win it, right? To have the early wave manipulation advantage over your opponent, you would take Bone Plating, right? So a good example of a matchup like that would be Renekton, right? Because you want to be able to trade with him, and if he does end up trading with you, he'll end up being in a situation where it's going to be pretty bad for him, right? Because you don't want to get chunked out. Now, if you go into a matchup, right, where you end up getting poked out, or in general, like, there's a lot of poke in the way that your opponent trades against you. So a good example would be Volibear, right? As the auto attacks the minion waves, the lightning starts hitting you. Second wind is key in that type of matchup because you combine it with Thorn Shield and you end up healing for a pretty good amount, right? And that's usually the way that you should cycle in between those two, like, you know, secondary, or like 2 secondary runes in this page. In the first part, there's Shield Bash and Demolish. Those are the two I kind of alternate in between whenever I do end up picking this rune, right? If I do have to use like the first part of the tree. Shield Bash just gives you a little bit of extra damage whenever you're training with your opponent at level 2, level 3 when you have your shield, right? And Demolish helps you get an extra play whenever you end up doing a 3 or 4 wave crash on your opponent, right? So you can alternate the pick based on that, or like, you know, if you want the extra damage or if you want a bit of a stronger crash to be able to get that play. And now the last couple of runes at the bottom here, right? I'm not going to mention Revitalize or Overgrowth because I don't really use them on Riven. Realistically, I only go into that tree whenever I go against like a pretty heavy CC team. So for example, you know, they have Annie, Leona, right? All that. Then you would end up taking Unflinching because you would combine it with the Tenacity rune on the primary tree, which is the Precision one, okay? So now moving away from the Resolve tree, right, we're going to talk about usually when you end up taking the Sorcery tree, okay? So a Sorcery tree you end up taking in matchups where you are going to be scaling and you don't necessarily need the early power, right? There are some instances though whenever people end up changing between combat summoner spells and utility summoner spell like the teleport, right? Where if you do end up taking Ignite, you can alternate between going Resolve and Sorcery just to end up getting the movement speed from the rune Nimbus Cloak. Because Nimbus Cloak allows you to chase out matchups the moment you pop your Ignite or Flash, etc., right? It gives you that extra movement speed, so it lets you chase down your opponent easier, right? So for example, a good matchup that I end up doing this in would be Darius. So typically against Darius, you can either go Resolve and go for the all-in early, and if he screws up, you kill him if you have Ignite, right? But if you go into the matchup and you have Nimbus Cloak, it's also doable, right? You just have to proc his Bone Plating with your third Q, and then as he starts chasing you down, you pop your Ignite, and then you have that extra movement speed. So it's kind of, you know, take your pick, right? If you feel confident in the matchup itself and you don't necessarily need that extra tankiness, you would go for the Sorcery tree in that instance, right? Just giving you examples. So Nimbus Cloak is really good if you're trying to chase down your opponent, especially if you have a combat summoner spell, right? Nullifying Orb is good into matchups that are, you know, heavy AP, or even have like parts of the matchup where their combos or trades can end up doing a decent amount of magic damage to you. So a good example would be something like Jax, right? If you end up playing in a Jax matchup and you start getting pretty low and you're both training against each other, the moment Jax versus W on you, right, you block most of his damage from it, etc. So you can, you know, if you feel like it would be pretty good in a matchup like that, you would end up taking that. And then for the next parts of the tree, one of the key ones that you want to have for Riven, because Riven is a cooldown based champion, right? Like her getting cooldown reduction on her is pretty efficient early. You would end up going for Transcendence with her most of the time that you end up going Sorcery. So you would do Sorcery, Nimbus Cloak, or Sorcery with Nullifying Orb, right? You don't really go Celerity on Riven, and you don't really go Absolute Focus either. Scorch does 2 little damage, and it's not as impactful on Riven early game, so it's kind of pointless to get it most of the time. And Water Walking and Gathering Storm. Water Walking doesn't really have that much of a place for Riven. Gathering Storm, on the other hand, you could use if you're going into a matchup and you just want to purely scale. You could do Transcendence and Gathering Storm. It's a pretty good rune page for scaling purposes. And then, you know, for like the offensive runes, right? You typically on Riven never want to do like an attack speed shard or anything like that. You want to go, you know, 9 adaptive force, 9 adaptive force, and armor or MR based on what type of matchup you're playing. Either if it's a magic damage matchup or if it's a physical matchup, right? So that's how you alternate between Sorcery and Resolve with Riven. But remember, for the primary one, you always go Conqueror and, well, the Precision tree with Riven. You don't really want to go into Electrocute or anything like that. 99.9% of the time. There might be some matchups and some key situations where like you might be able to get away with that, but even then it's like it's safer to just do Conqueror with Resolve or Conqueror with Sorcery. Okay, now we're going to talk about the items, the core items for Riven in order to succeed like in this like new ranked season, right? It honestly hasn't really changed much. I know that Riot initially with the rework of items wanted to make it so like there was more variety, right, in the type of builds that you ended up doing and how you adapted to each situation, right? But it kind of ended up being a little bit of the opposite, and for the most part, you're going to be, at least for Mythics, right, you're going to be wanting to go with Core Drinker 99% of the time. as much as I love innovating, right, and trying different builds and going more lethality or crit Riven, right, etc., all this stuff, Gore Drinker is just too good on Riven to go anything else, realistically. People have tested going Sunder, they've gone the lethality mythics, right? And honestly, they don't really work that well. There has been this instance, I believe, where people have tested Electrocute with one of the lethality mythics, and it can be kind of okay in some matchups, but realistically, you still want to just do Gore Drinker, right, with Conqueror, and just, you know, play the most optimal way with Riven 99% of the time. You don't really want to like end up trolling any of your games due to like atomization or anything like that, right? So that's the main mythic item that you want to go for 99% of your games, right? So typically you want to finish your mythic as fast as possible in the current season. Riven is not in a state where you want to rush cooldown reduction like crazy on her, right? You want to make sure you finish the mythic first, and you want to make sure you end up picking her and building the items in a way where you get damage. So for example, in your recall, right? In the past, we used to do something like recalling, getting Warhammer, Kindle Gem, right? It's because we would go for like part of the Black Cleaver, or we would go recalling Warhammer into Gore Drinker, and then after Gore Drinker we would finish it into Black Cleaver, right? We don't really want to do that anymore, just because of the way that cooldown reduction works, right? Or at least how they changed it. Because initially, back then, when we used to rush the cooldown reduction, it was flat. Now with haste, it works a little bit differently. So you want to do Gore Drinker first, right? And then if you're really, really ahead, you would go Lucidity Boots, right? If you're extremely ahead and you just want to snowball and make sure you just win the game, like this is kind of like a greed buy. If you're really behind, really behind, you would go Lucidity Boots as well, because you don't really have the gold to, you know, like if you go Tabby or something like that, at that point you're kind of screwed, so you might as well get it for the cooldown reduction. Now, if you're going even in gold and you're scaling pretty well, I recommend still going Tabby or Mercs based on like what you need against the enemy team composition, right? If you're not necessarily like, you're not snowballing like crazy, but then you're not behind either, right? And you're just scaling normally. So you know, they have their options, but a lot of the time you want to do Lucidity Boots on Riven. It's really strong, especially because they ended up buffing the cooldown reduction on it, like you know, pretty long ago. After Gore Drinker and your boots, right? Your secondary item is probably the one that will change the most based on the team compositions that you're going against and the matchups that you're playing against. So, for example, if you're playing against a Darius, right? And you're snowballing the matchup pretty hard, and you notice that the enemy Darius isn't stacking armor or anything like that, you would go Ghostblade. So Ghostblade is your probably main lethality item that you want to go for if you're going against a semi-squishy team and you're snowballing, right? If you're going against a Darius and he's kind of building a little bit of armor, right, and he's getting kind of tanky, or even the enemy team has a little bit of armor, you could alternate between Ghostblade and Black Cleaver, right? Black Cleaver is a little bit situational nowadays, right? Because it's not instantly bought as a second item for Riven anymore. And honestly, there's also been this trend that a lot of like I noticed a lot of the European high elo like Riven players ended up doing, which was they actually end up taking Last Whisper after Gore Drinker in situations where like the enemy team is stacking a decent amount of armor, right? They actually skipped lethality item, and they also skip Black Cleaver, and they alternated between Sereldia's, right, or the other Last Whisper item, right, the one with crit. So those are pretty much like the 4 items that you're going to be alternating through most of the games, and most of the games are decided around like the 3-4 item mark, right? So it's something to keep in mind. You're going to want, like for the late game items, right? You're going to want Serpent's Fang against like heavy shield teams, right? That's something to think about. If you go against heavy AD teams, you would want to go Death Dance, right, with Tabby. And so you get a little bit more of a, you know, adaptation later in, like, you know, 4 items in or so. Not so much like in the first few items. The first few items is usually just Gore Drinker, and, you know, like I was explaining earlier. So Death Dance is extremely good against heavy AD teams, right? So you end up picking that against that. If you go against like Lulu, Janna, and then, you know, a bunch of shield bow champions, Serpent's Fang is key, so you need to take that. If you go against like a magic damage matchup where like you literally cannot survive, it's just too strong, or they have too much magic damage on the enemy team, you can still go for Maw of Marmortius, or you can just go into Hex Drinker and not actually finish it, right? And then you can also mix it in with GA, right? GA is actually still extremely good on Riven. The item allows you to dive deeper into a team fight to reach the enemy carries, right? And it gives you the tools to engage a team fight without the risk of just dying. So it's really a great item for forcing aggressive plays and to just essentially like just win more situations in a way that's like really forceful, right? And then there's like QSS. You end up taking QSS if you're going against a champion or a champion matchup like Malzahar or something like that, or Skarner ult that can just like, you know, lock you down, and it kind of screws over your chance of carrying, right? Edge of Night is like an okay lethality item for Riven that you can end up picking as like a third or fourth item, right? You know, if there's an ability that's annoying you, and like I don't know, like a Lux Q or something like that ends up catching you, Edge of Night could be pretty decent, right? But I honestly don't really take it as much in my games, so but it's just something to think about that you can end up picking up. And then if you're going against like a heavy team that's like, or like a team that's heavy on healing, you would end up doing, you know, you would go Executioners early because you want to make sure to cut down the healing. But then later in, you'd be, you know, upgrading it up to Chempunk Chainsword. So that pretty much goes for the first 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 items, right? For Riven, you don't really have, like I said, a lot of variance when it comes to the first 2 to 3 items. It's usually in between that little, you know, path that I was talking about between Gore Drinker, Ghostblade, Last Whisper, or Black Cleaver, right? And like I said, I would argue that nowadays more people end up doing a Gore Drinker into Ghostblade or Gore Drinker into Seraldias, right? As like the main items for Riven. So yeah, if you follow that route with her in your rank games, especially for the season start, you'll be fine. It'll be pretty optimized. There's not really much else to think about with her. So like you notice, it hasn't really changed much from like the older season or anything like that. Typically, we'll draft different or like, you know, we'll think about different itemization or different like little tools to be more creative if the runes themselves change drastically. So if Conqueror ends up changing to be like, you know, way more damage or changes in a different way, right, then we can start messing with like crit builds or lethality builds, etc. So, you know, that's pretty much it for the items. One note that I wanted to talk about is that a lot of people ask me about, hey, what about full lethality Riven with Electrocute or anything like that? And usually I would say, you guys know me, like, I really like itemization for Riven that makes her an assassin, right? I like when I'm able to go into a team fight, I have like crit and like barely an HP, and it's like a kind of like back and forth, and I can die really quickly. The thing is, it's not really optimal. And even now in these, like that last season and this season, it's not something that you can experiment with. Why? Because Riven becomes too squishy and it just doesn't work. You get blown up and you don't do enough damage either way. So that's why you don't end up doing those type of things anymore. The reason we were able to do it before in previous seasons was because Conqueror was true damage, and it kind of worked like Grasp in a way. So you would stack Conqueror on the wave, right? And then the moment that your opponent came up to you, you would start fighting, and even if they had armor or not, they would just die, right? So you could go lethality, you could have done crit builds with Essence Reaver, because you'd have 70 AD and do true damage at the same time with 20% cooldown reduction, etc. So that's why there was more creative builds back then. So if you guys really want like more creative builds from what it is now, you guys just gotta ask Riot for more changes, I suppose. So, but yeah, hopefully this video helps you guys out and it gives you guys a better idea of what like you should be building in your ranked games and everything. So anyway, good luck with the season start. It starts in a couple of days, and I hope you guys do well. I hope you guys obtain the rank that you want. Peace out, bros.